I'm Gina, and this is Weird True Crime. Welcome back to my little corner of the true crime world. I am so happy to have you. I hope everyone is doing really well out there. I know I still sound horrible, and this is kind of just who I am now. So we're kind of just gonna work through it and see how this goes. I hope everyone had a good weekend. I don't have anything that exciting or positive to report. We're still dealing with sicknesses. I decided to cut off all of my hair and color it back to its original dark shade. For those of you who follow me on Instagram, you probably saw me post a picture of it the other day. I was completely obsessed with it for the entire weekend and honestly for the entirety of this week. It is such a huge change that my brain is just having a hard time comprehending it, and my anxiety has been like in full swing over it, which is ridiculous because it's hair. But I think I'm finally learning to love the 80s vibe that I am definitely giving off now because I have embraced my very wavy curly hair. It's a vibe, and I'm just going to own it and see where this road takes me. Yep, that's my plan. My family and I also have a very huge trip coming up. We are going to Ireland at the beginning of October. We're actually going to take the kids out of school for a week because taking them overseas to Ireland to experience a completely different culture for a week is basically school. They'll learn a lot over there, and I'm so excited to see their little faces on their first flight. So we are prepping for that, and I am so excited because I have never been anywhere, and this will be the first stamp in my passport. We also start a new adventure in basketball today. Both of our kids are going to try basketball this season, and Dad is going to help coach the teams. My kids have never been very sporty, but we've reached a point where we decided they need to at least try something, at least for the experience and learning how to work in a team and take direction from a coach and just kind of learn what it means to be respectful and work with other people on a team. So I'm super excited to go watch my little 6-year-old try to play basketball tonight at practice. So that's really all that's going on with me right now. But from a case perspective, this one is huge. I actually don't know if this is going to be 1 or 2 episodes. Right now, I'm thinking probably 2 because I'm looking at the clock and I know how many pages I have written out on this case. So it's probably going to be 2. But we are covering the disappearance and murder of Dorothy Jane Scott today, and probably next time. Dorothy Jane Scott is a woman whose case has been covered multiple times by many different sources, podcasts, TV shows, blogs, you name it. This is one that's really interesting, and it is still unsolved. So I was excited to kind of put pen to paper and do my own research and pull together all of the best resources and information that I could find on this case into one place so I could share it with others. So we're just going to get into it because there's a lot to cover here. And I want to start with the day she disappeared, and then we'll work backwards from there. Dorothy Jane Scott, she was 32 when she disappeared from the UC Irvine Medical Center in California. She disappeared in the early morning hours of May 28th on 1980. And she had actually been attending an employee meeting where she worked at the Swingers Psych Shop and Custom John's Head Shop in Anaheim, California. And she was attending this meeting when she noticed one of her coworkers, a man by the name of Conrad Bostrom. He was acting really strange. His arm was swollen and he had this red inflamed bug bite on his arm, and he was really out of it. She actually went over and talked to him to ask him if he was feeling okay, and just the way that he responded and the vibe she was getting made her really uncomfortable. So she actually told her manager, hey, we need to cut this meeting short because Conrad really needs to go to the hospital to have this bite checked out. This is concerning. So the meeting ended and she took him to the hospital, and another one of their coworkers, Pam Head, who was actually 18 at this time, offered to accompany them. So Dorothy actually had her son, Sean, with her at the meeting. So she didn't want to take Sean to the hospital, understandably. So she actually made a quick stop at her parents' house with her coworkers in the car to drop off her son, Sean, so her parents could watch him while she was at the hospital. So original reports and articles state that she stopped by the house to check on her son, who was already at her parents' house. But a recent interview from 2021 with Pam Head by Anthony Shurlock, who writes at the blog crimeblogger1983.blogspot.com, he actually revealed that Sean was at the meeting with his mom, which makes more sense for why she would have stopped by her parents' house on the way to the hospital instead of just calling them from work to tell them that she would be late picking Sean up. There's really no reason for her to stop by the house if Sean was already there. So I feel like that made much more sense in the timeline, that Sean was actually with her at the time of the meeting. Dorothy's parents, Jacob and Vera Scott, were, of course, more than happy to keep their grandson while Dorothy did what she did best, which was to help others. So while she was at her parents' house, her mother convinced her to change out of the black scarf that she was wearing for a warmer red scarf. I mean, it is May in California, so I'm not sure what the temperature would have been like after sunset, but looking at Google, it states that it can get into the 50s at night, which is pretty chilly, and that's the 50s now, so it could have been even cooler, in 1980. So maybe her mom, Vera, figured it would be cold in the hospital and that it was chilly outside, so she kind of convinced Dorothy to take a warmer option so she wouldn't get as chilly, which makes sense. And you may be thinking to yourself, why does it matter what scarf she was wearing? I mean, where is this going? What's the point in the story? But it will make more sense about why the color of this scarf is so crucial later. Once they were at the hospital and Conrad was in the back being seen, Pam and Dorothy, do what you do when you're sitting in the waiting room at the hospital. You watch TV and you flip through magazines, and they probably just sat around and chit-chatted while they waited for Conrad to finish. And Pam stated in later interviews that Dorothy never left her sight the entire time they were waiting. So she didn't get up to go to the bathroom. She didn't get up to make a phone call. Remember, this was 1980, so it's not like cell phones or a thing, or she could sit there and call her parents to check on her son or something if she wanted to. So she was with Pam the entire time. So Conrad was finally discharged around 11 p.m. that night on May 28th. And this was when Dorothy and Pam found out that he had actually been bitten by a black widow spider, which is deadly in some circumstances. So it was a really good call on Dorothy's part to insist that he got seen by doctors. Conrad was, of course, given an antibiotic to treat the bite, and he needed to fill that prescription in the pharmacy in the hospital, which is pretty cool. I don't know of any pharmacies that are actually inside of hospitals around here, but maybe I just haven't been to the right ones. So while Conrad and Pam went to fill this prescription, Dorothy offered to bring her car around. So she took off in one direction while Conrad and Pam went in the other. So Dorothy went to the bathroom before she went outside into the parking lot to get into her white 1973 Toyota station wagon so she could bring it up to the front, because she didn't really want Conrad walking all the way through the parking lot to get to the car in the condition that he was in, because, she's a nice person. So he and Pam get this prescription filled, and they come outside to meet Dorothy, and she wasn't there. So they waited, they don't know whether somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes for Dorothy to come pull up in the car, when she never did, which it really shouldn't take that long. I mean, I don't know how big this parking lot was, but you wouldn't think that it would take that long for her to walk to the car and then drive it up to the front of the building to get them. So after they've waited these minutes and she hasn't come, they decide to walk through the parking lot towards the car to meet her. And while walking through this lot, they see a car matching Dorothy's description just speed past them really, really quickly. And they even wave, and you kind of like wave out to the car, to get her attention or get the person's attention that's driving, because of course at this point they believe it to be Dorothy. But this car doesn't slow down at all. It actually runs the stop sign at the exit of the hospital and just takes off down the road, which of course is really strange to Pam and Conrad because, she's supposed to be picking them up, and instead she completely blows past them and takes off out of the hospital parking lot. Some sources say that they waited 2 hours for her to come back, but I didn't see Pam refer to this in any of her interviews. I couldn't verify how long they actually waited between when this occurred and when they decided to start calling around, trying to find out more information. But after the car doesn't return and they don't see or hear from Dorothy, Pam says that they decided to call Dorothy's parents' house to see if maybe she'd returned home to check on Sean, or if maybe something had happened to make her return home so quickly. And I just want to add here that it's not weird or unusual that Pam would have called Dorothy's parents, because they were actually the employees of the businesses where Dorothy worked were actually very familiar with Dorothy's father, Jacob, because he used to own the head shop and the other business where they all worked. And it was known that he still did odd jobs at the business to make repairs or whatever it was. So he was still very involved in the day-to-day affairs, and the employees knew him really well. So it would make sense that Pam probably knew his number off the top of her head. These days, I don't think you would probably know that number off the top of your head, but back then it was pretty common to remember those kinds of numbers. So, she knew him well and probably felt comfortable enough calling and being like, hey, did Dorothy go back home? Because she was supposed to just come up here and pick us up, and she took off and we haven't seen her. But of course, Jacob says that she hadn't come back to the house to pick up Sean or see them for any reason. And so Pam and Conrad are just left really confused. And after this information, Pam kind of had a bad feeling about the situation, rightfully so, and she decided to call the police and alert them of what had happened. And she said in her interview that she couldn't really tell if police took her seriously or not, but they did come out and look at the scene. But there wasn't any evidence that alarmed them enough to consider the possibility of foul play. They figured, for whatever reason, maybe she just decided to take off, and they couldn't really look into it anymore past that point. I don't really understand how this was no cause for alarm or didn't ring any warning bells. If she was perfectly content sitting there waiting with Pam for Conrad for this extended amount of time while he was in the emergency room, and then even offers to go out of her way to walk out to the lot to bring this car up so Conrad doesn't have to walk, why would she just suddenly take off with no warning? And also, if she had other commitments or a reason to be back by a certain time, I don't know why she would have agreed or offered to take him to the hospital if there was something else going on. Also, because she seems like a pretty forthright person, if there was something concerning her that made her feel like she needed to go home, wouldn't she have let her coworkers know that she needed to get back home and that they needed to find another way to get back home? I don't see her just stranding them with no reason. In the interview that Pam did with Anthony Shurlock from Crime Blogger 1983, she actually said that she wasn't sure if it was Pam's car that they saw leave the parking lot. She also said that the headlights were not on when she was talking to Anthony Shurlock, but in the interview on the Paula Zahn episode that I watched, she did say that the headlights were on. Maybe Pam just got confused in all of the different retellings of the story, or maybe so much time has passed that she's starting to kind of question herself in what she saw. I know that that can happen, especially when a lot of time has passed. You start maybe remembering things a little differently, or the details get fuzzy. I mean, I can't remember things that happened a week ago, so I don't know that I could recount something that happened 40 years ago. Also, in early newspapers, it was said that there was another car parked in front of Dorothy's car in the parking lot, but I couldn't find any other information on that. So after she took off and Pam found out that she had not returned home, she decided to call the police and file a missing persons report. But unfortunately, the police had to take this missing person report a little more seriously about 4 hours later, when a resident called the police to report smoke in an alleyway. So when police got to the scene around 4:30 a.m., they found this car in the alley just engulfed in flames. Luckily, there was no sign of anyone in the car once they had everything under control and the fire had been put out. But it was confirmed that this was Dorothy's car. And Sergeant Bob Taft, who's the current cold case investigator assigned to this case, said that whoever did this to the car was obviously in a hurry because the headlights were still on when police found the car on fire and the driver's side door was open. So obviously they were trying to destroy all evidence and get out of there quickly and, just kind of left everything running and open. And investigators did find a gas canister in the trunk of the car. I don't know if that was Dorothy's gas canister or if whoever took the car put it there, but there was also accelerant found on the passenger side of the car, like in the seat and floorboards, and just like that general area. And the outer front of the car was left pretty much intact. So if you see pictures of the car, once it's been impounded and like put in the junkyard, if you look at the front of it, it looks pretty fine. But once you kind of go around the side, you can see that the interior of the car and like the back end of the car is just completely destroyed, obliterated. Like, all of the cloth is gone. You can't really make out any of the main parts of the car. It's just destroyed. And that's the only thing that they found. There was no sign of Dorothy. None of her stuff was in the car, and they really had no idea what had happened to her. So that's what happened to Dorothy that night. Now I want to backtrack and talk about Dorothy's background and her life before this horrible event happened to her. Dorothy was 32 at the time of her disappearance. She was a single mother with a 4-year-old boy named Shanti, who she called Sean. And she actually lived with her aunt in Stanton, California, which was about a 20-minute drive from her parents' house in Anaheim. And her job as a bookkeeper at the 2 stores, the Swinger Psych Shop and the Custom John's Head Shop, those were also in Anaheim. So her parents lived pretty close to where she worked and would often keep Sean for her while she was working. And the shops that she worked at were owned by a man named John Kikola, who had purchased the businesses from Dorothy's father. I don't know how long he had owned the businesses when Dorothy was working there or what that timeline of events was, but I have a feeling that Dorothy probably worked there because those were her father's businesses and she was still involved with them because she herself was like a pretty quiet, straight-laced person. She was also said to be very, very Christian, and I'm sure that this was just a job of convenience for her, needing to make money for her and her kid, because otherwise I don't see someone with her personality type working in a head shop, which is like, more for like the hippie, free-loving type of people back then, and she doesn't really seem to fit that mold. So it's interesting to me that she would work somewhere like that. But that's just kind of my own 2 cents about thinking about where she works versus the type of person that it sounds like she was. Anyway, her son, Sean, his father is a man named Dennis Terry, and he was living in Fairgrove, Missouri at the time of her disappearance. And Dorothy was really private. She was super quiet about their relationship. Even her parents and her brother really didn't know much about the history of that relationship when Sean was born. It sounds like she was actually part of an all-girls band, and she had been touring with them for a while when she was in this relationship with Sean's father, and they had a baby together, but they were never married. And then eventually she decided to move back to Anaheim with Sean. Once she moved back home, she really didn't speak much about the situation or the history of the relationship or really who Dennis was or the type of person they was or like what happened to dissolve this relationship. So she was just super private about it, and her family didn't know much more than that. Dennis had actually been in town visiting a few days before the incidents happened. And interestingly enough, they had gotten into a pretty big argument because Dennis decided that he wanted custody of Sean. And because Dorothy had had full custody of him for the previous 4 years, remember, he's only 4 years old, Dennis now wanted full custody of him for the next 4 years. Completely understandable. Dorothy shut down this idea, and it caused a huge argument between them. And honestly, I think it's good that his dad wanted to be a part of his life, but the instability and confusion that would come with uprooting a child after only knowing his mother for 4 years would cause a huge negative impact on him in such a big way. And it sounds like, if anything, if Dennis wanted to be a bigger part of his life, the conversation should have been about both of their living situations and maybe coming to an agreement about living closer to each other so that way Sean could have both of his parents in his life. But I can understand why Dorothy would be so upset about the possibility of Sean just leaving her and going to live with his dad for 4 years after really, it seems like, not knowing him very much at all. Because of that, it's pretty obviously Dennis was looked at pretty closely after Dorothy's disappearance, but we'll get into more of that later. And outside of her history with Sean's father, like I said, she was really quiet. She preferred to stay at home and spend time with her family. She didn't smoke or drink, and she was a very devout Christian. And her father, Jacob, said that she didn't have any sort of steady boyfriends or even go on dates that often. So there were really no men that were actively in her life at all during this time of her disappearance. A few months before this happened, in October of 1979, Dorothy started getting really weird phone calls while she was at work and at home. And she told her mother, Vera, about these calls, and she said that the callers sounded familiar, but she couldn't place him or where she knew him from, which is really unfortunate because that would have solved everything. These calls started as being very loving, telling Dorothy that he wanted to be romantically involved with her, that he had feelings with her. And once Dorothy shut this down, the calls started becoming more threatening and mean. On one occasion, close to when she disappeared, she received a call from him telling her that he had a present for her and that she needed to go outside to see it. And there was a dead rose left on the hood of her car. And as time passed, of course, Dorothy began to get more and more fearful because of these calls that she was getting at home and work. And she had actually moved 3 times between October of 1979 and May 1980 because of these calls. So she was moving because she was afraid that this person knew where she lived, and he probably did, and he's calling her on her home phone. And she had even gotten to the point where she had started considering purchasing a gun, but she was really scared that Sean would get a hold of it and end up hurting himself. So she decided not to get one, which I completely understand. I know that must have been kind of a hard decision for her to come to because she was concerned about her own safety, but it shows what kind of mother she was that she decided against it because she didn't want anything to potentially happen to her son. So she had actually started taking karate classes a week before she disappeared. And one of the last calls that she received from this man, he told her that he would get her alone and cut her into bits so no one would ever find her. Unfortunately, the whole case reminds me of something that happened to my own mother. So my mom, she had a few stalkers, unfortunately, at different points in her life. And one was when my brother was very young in the early 70s, and my dad was in the Air Force, so he was gone pretty frequently. If not overseas, then, he would be gone for a couple days at a time, sometime to do stuff at the Air Force base. And my mom had a stalker who knew what my dad's schedule was, so he would call their apartment when my dad was gone, and only when my dad was gone. And there were other things that made her believe that he was watching her and kind of knew where she was and what she was doing at different times of the day, which is terrifying. And I think that just kind of finally stopped on its own. But then, when I was young, in the 80s, she had another stalker who would leave notes on her car in the parking lot complimenting her outfit for the day. I remember her telling me about that and how scary it was. And thank goodness that nothing more ever came of it, because that in itself was really, really terrifying for her. And I'm really glad that it never turned into anything more than that. But it's cases like these that make you understand just how terrifying that a situation like this can be for someone. So thankfully, my mom is okay. And it's really sad that Dorothy's story did not end up the same way. So we're going to fast forward back to the night at the hospital now. So police looked around at this area where her car had been parked, and they did find a pack of Marlboro cigarettes and a box of tissues on the ground where her car had been. And while these items could have fallen out of her car, it was known that Dorothy didn't smoke. So the chances of the cigarettes belonging to her were pretty slim, and police didn't see these items of proof of foul play, which makes sense because there's no real definitive way to connect those to any sort of crime scene. After her abduction at this hospital, Dorothy's father, Jacob, he was working really closely with the police department, and they decided to keep the case quiet because they didn't want to give too much information away to people who could use that information to make hoax calls or accusations or hurt their chances of figuring out what really happened here. So Jacob Scott and Dorothy's brother, Jim Scott, they went together to look at the remains of Dorothy's car. And Jim said in his interview on the episode with Paula Zahn that it was heart-wrenching and so hard to see her vehicle completely destroyed like that. And I can't even imagine what must have been going through his mind, other than just like pure devastation and concern for her sister's safety, because seeing her car like that, I'm sure it's really hard to imagine any sort of positive outcome coming out of it. To make matters worse, about a week after Dorothy's disappearance and the discovery of her car, the Scotts received a phone call to their home. And when Dorothy's mom, Vera, picked up the phone, the caller asked, "Are you related to Dorothy Scott?" And when Vera said yes, the caller just said, "I've got her," and hung up. So after 2 weeks and no new leads, Jacob decided to take this to the newspaper. So he went to the Santa Ana Register and ran the story of Dorothy's disappearance and what happened to her vehicle. And this article ran on Thursday, June 11th of 1980, and they also offered a $2,500 reward for anyone with information regarding what happened to Dorothy. The same day that this article was published, the managing editor at the Santa Ana Register, somebody by the name of Pat Riley, they received a phone call while they were in the newsroom. And the caller said that he had been the one that kidnapped Dorothy. And Riley said that the caller also said that Dorothy was his love and that he had caught her cheating with another man. She denied having someone else. I killed her. Riley said that he felt like he had a really good read on people and that this man was genuine and that it wasn't a hoax caller. He also said that the man shared information about the kidnapping that wasn't known to the general public. So this caller said that he knew that Dorothy was at the hospital that night with her coworkers and that Conrad had a spider bite. And the caller also said that Dorothy was wearing a red scarf, which is where that comes into play because, remember, she had been wearing a black scarf earlier in the night and then changed into a red scarf before going to the hospital. And this caller also said that Dorothy had actually called him from the hospital to tell him where she was and why she was there. But Pam, her coworker, had told investigators that Dorothy never left her side the whole time, which means that there's no way she could have made a phone call. And the only time that they were separated was when Dorothy went to use the restroom and grab her car to pick them up in the front of the building. I mean, there is a possibility that she could have called someone between that time when Conrad and Pam were waiting for the prescription. So maybe she called someone and used the bathroom and went to pick up the car. But that really doesn't leave much time for someone to show up and abduct her from the hospital. If that were true, I guess Dorothy also could have called someone from her parents' house before going to the hospital. But at that time, they did not know that Conrad had been bitten by a black widow, so there's no way she could have relayed that information to someone before going to the hospital. So this doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I'm sure there are explanations for how somebody could have known this, but no one recalls hearing or knowing of a conversation she had with someone else. There are theories that her stalker or probably killer could have been another coworker, and that's how the person knew where she was. But again, without being there with her, how would they have known that she changed her scarf or that Conrad had been diagnosed with a black widow spider bite? The other theory is that maybe the stalker confronted her in the parking lot and was mad because she was with another man. So she explained to him why she was there and what had happened in an attempt to de-escalate the situation. And that's how this person knew that that's why she was at the hospital. It's not like today where she could have been in contact with anyone at any time, sitting there texting someone while she was in the waiting room. That's just not a possibility in 1980. And another weird note, Sergeant Taft also said that the editor said that the person on the phone sounded Southern and possibly black, which I'm not really sure how they could identify the color of a person's skin from the sound of their voice. I kind of feel like that's drawing conclusions that aren't necessarily there. And Taft did say that this description did not at all match with the description of the caller who was calling Dorothy previously, or the later description of the caller that was calling Dorothy's parents. So police tend to believe that the caller at the newsroom was probably a hoax because at this point, this article had been published, and so the general public knew where Dorothy had been the night that she disappeared. The only questionable thing is that the caller knew specific things about what Dorothy had been wearing that night, and those things had not been published in that article in the newspaper. Police did put in a phone tap on the phone at the newsroom or at the newspaper to see if they could get a recording of the person's voice if they were to call again. But of course they never did. So there was no more information that they could gain from that source. It's really a shame that there wasn't ever a recording of that voice to compare to the later phone recordings from the person that was calling Dorothy's parents weekly to determine whether or not it really was the same person, because that could have cleared up a lot of confusion and questions around whether or not those two callers were the same person, or if the caller in the newsroom really was just somebody trying to ruffle feathers and be a giant pain in the ass. It is still weird that that person knew details about that night that had not been released to the public regarding what she was wearing and what was found out while the three of them were at the hospital. I do want to stop it here for this episode just because the next portion is also pretty detailed and important, and I think this is a really good place to stop it for now, kind of just the details of what happened that night and right after, and then we can dive deeper into what happened after she was found in 1984 in the next episode. I hope you liked this one so far. Like I said, this case is very full of lots of information, and I don't want to say holes, but just things that leave you with a lot of questions, unfortunately, and I don't think we're ever going to get answers for a lot of these things. Stay tuned for the next one. If you enjoyed this one, please make sure to go follow me on Instagram at weirdtruecrime, and I'll post some pictures of Dorothy and her car and other interesting scenes from the alley. And also feel free to email me at weirdtruecrime@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. Just say hi. Give me any kooky, weird stories that you may have. Let me know what you think. Oh, I also have a blog, weirdtruecrime.com. I will be posting the actual true crime cases on the blog too, for readable versions of the cases in case you enjoy sitting there and just reading through all the information, and I'll post pictures on the blog as well. So that's another option if you're looking for more details on any of the things that we talk about here. And otherwise, until next time, stay safe, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.